Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Talking Environment. I'm your host, Gevorg Ghazaryan, and today we are honored to have Professor Simon Richter joining us. Professor Richter is the class of 1965 endowed term professor of German and Dutch literature and culture at the University of Pennsylvania with an interest in the intersection of literature, culture, and environment. Professor Richter also initiated the Penn 1.5 minute climate lectures and co-founded the Climate Week at Penn. So welcome to the show, Professor Richter.
Thank you very much, Gevorg.
Awesome. So before we start, could you please give us an introduction of what do you do? How did you come to Penn and your journey?
Okay, so my, the journey is long and winding. I started as a scholar of the 18th century, so of the Enlightenment, mostly German, but European, and I guess more widely. And now I mostly focus on cultural aspects of the climate emergency. So, how did I get from point A to point B? That was, as I said, a long and winding road. Um, but I think there are a few moments in that journey that I would very quickly identify. One is being the academic director of Penn's exchange program in Berlin in the academic year 2011 and 2012. Um, uh, I taught a course then for our Penn students and other Ivy League members of the consortium on the cultural history of the environmental movement in Germany. Basically, what I wanted to understand was the first for me too. I wanted to understand um, why was it that Germany had a viable Green Party that was actually in government and making a difference? Why was it at that time that Germany was successful or seemed to be successful, at least was making lots of headway on the energy transition to renewables? Why was it that the German population overwhelmingly was ready to pay a premium in order to advance that energy transition? It seemed to me those were cultural questions. And so I thought, okay, we got to figure this one out. And so we looked deeply, and I discovered that it had a lot to do with the literature that really concerned me. So for one thing we discovered was that the German word for sustainability, which is Nachhaltigkeit, was used already in a textbook on forestry in 1713. Right. So Germans are already thinking about sustainable yield forestry and not just thinking about it, but actually introducing it as a practice in their university system, in the courses that they taught on forestry. So that was one thing. Another, I guess, was becoming a father. Which I did a little bit earlier than that, but it really, after I taught this course, it really dawned on me, oh my gosh, I've got two boys. And, right now they're about your age. And so as they were growing up, and I became more and more aware of, how urgent and how momentous and how enormous the climate emergency was, I realized I have to do something. In fact, I have to do everything I can. And so and in my mind, that always means, and this can get sloppy, I guess, but that always means, not separating between my life and my research and my teaching and so on. And so basically, what I did is I made the climate emergency the premise for everything that I do at the university. So my research, my teaching, and my service, they all start from an awareness of the climate emergency. And then I go on to ask myself, what can I do?
Awesome, that's great. That's a great story. And um, as you already like gave us an intro to your work at Penn, could you also give us a short introduction of the couple of initiatives, the Climate Week at Penn and the climate lectures, and how they have
Yeah.
worked?
Yeah. Okay. We'll start with the climate lectures
Yeah.
because that came first. They're called the Penn 1.5 minute climate
Mhm.
lectures. The 1.5 is, of course, a conceit. It refers to the 1.5 degrees Celsius that, under the best circumstances, ideally we would not uh, 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 go past. Um, 1.5 degrees of warming since the Industrial Revolution is already problematic in terms of how our climate system or our Earth's climate system changes. But going beyond 1.5 is really serious. I mean, it begins to become catastrophic at a scale that is really difficult to deal with and will cause lots of suffering. All right, so the idea was to invite professors and other academics at the University of Pennsylvania to speak to the climate emergency briefly from the perspective of their discipline, but also personally, and to the degree that they were comfortable doing so. So I took this idea to Paul Snigovsky, who still is the college dean, so the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, because he was sort of the host of the 60-second lectures.
Yeah.
And this was clearly an attempt to hijack the 60-second lectures and to give them a climate focus by turning them into 1.5, with the instruction to the people who were preparing these lectures that they could and should go beyond 1.5 in order to show 1.5 minutes, in order to show how difficult it is to stay below 1.5. The first set of climate lectures occurred in September, maybe 6 years ago. I'm not quite sure. That amounted to 20 lectures in all, 5 every Wednesday for 4 weeks running. Fabulous lectures, also across the disciplines, right? So from English, from philosophy, from the design school, etc., in order to show that, it doesn't matter what discipline you're working in or studying, climate change intersects with what you're doing. And there are people who are asking questions and finding answers that would concern you, no matter where you come from. And so that's the climate lectures. Briefly on Climate Week, that was an idea that Billy Fleming from the design school and I came up with. Billy said, Simon, we're celebrating I think it was the 25th anniversary of Earth Week, and Earth Week was a really, really big deal at Penn. I mean, it was enormous. You have no idea how big it was. It brought tens of thousands of people to Penn. There were, the cast of Hair came to Philadelphia in order to sing one of the songs from it. People from the Beatniks generation, like Gary Snyder, I think, but for sure, is it Ginsberg? Allen Ginsberg was here. There were, really, really notable people. Why Penn? Because of Larry McHarg. But it was a student-driven thing. So Penn students got this thing rolling, and it was huge. And so we wanted to celebrate that or take note of it, because there are also some problems with it. We wanted to take note of it and use that as a sort of jumping off point for, Penn rising to that occasion again, this time not some, sure, in connection with Earth Day themes, but in the context of climate change. And so Billy and I took that idea to the provost. The provost approved it. We went to deans. They also thought it was a really important and good idea. It was scheduled to happen during the Earth Week that year, but COVID intervened. And so we kicked it into the fall and did the first 2 online. But since then, it has become sort of institutionalized, but it's still very much driven not by administrators, but rather by the faculty and the students who are involved.
Awesome, that's great. And I've also, when I first came to Penn, it was interesting to go to the lectures about the climate, and it's also a great way to kind of know about a lot of things in a short kind of time. So it's great. It's actually, and we also had a guest, John Hawkins. If you are familiar with him, he was also involved with the Climate Week, and is also
that's correct. He is now a member of the core planning team.
So
he's from Earth and Environmental Science. I should also mention, since we're in Kelly Ryder's house, that Kelly Ryder's house was a very early participant in Climate Week. So that matters for 2 reasons. One, we thought of Kelly Ryder's house and asked, and 2, Kelly Ryder's house said, yes, climate emergency matters, and we have a way, from our perspective, to contribute to Climate Week.
Awesome, yeah, and I think it's really important that all the institutions of the houses get together and support. And this year is going to be in the fall, right?
Yes.
In October or
Yes, in October.
awesome.
Mhm.
Yeah. So we will look out for that. And so moving forward, could you give us a brief intro of how culture and climate change intersect? I mean, we probably kind of have an idea of how they can intersect, the impact of storytelling, of how the cinema, the art, the movies affect on us. But could you give us like an intro of how it works, the intersection between them?
Yeah, sure. Brief is hard, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try. Um, okay, so you got climate scientists on one side. You've got engineers and others who are sort of solution driven as well. And then across a gulf, you have policymakers, opinion makers, the public, educational institutions, etc. And the space in between them, I'm going to identify for the purposes of this conversation as culture.
Mhm.
There's a disconnect, continues, but there was a really, really strong disconnect between what the scientists were doing, what the engineers were doing, and the let's say the lack of their ability to communicate to a broader public so that you get the kind of critical mass, the kind of momentum, the public opinion, policymakers prioritizing climate change related things, et cetera. There's a gap there. And that's the opportunity for people who are concerned with communication. And that can be, journalism for sure, other forms of communication that aren't necessarily, let's say, in the realm of the creative arts. Though it's really difficult for me to separate these things out. I mean, some of the people I read with great admiration and profit are climate journalists. They are masters of their craft, right?
Mhm.
But at any rate, so it's in that space. And there's a whole lot that happens there, right? And it can be in terms of film, it's social media, et cetera, things that go viral, that catch
Mhm.
lots and lots of people's attention and so on. But to my thinking, and this concerns my own work, let's say, um, going viral isn't necessarily the goal. Having the products of our creative efforts, seen by millions of people, isn't necessarily what we're aiming for. What we're aiming for is impact, right? And not impact in a way that just diffuses over the world, but very targeted kinds of impact. So to bring this really to the work that I'm doing with my partner Joshua Mosley and the students that I work with, and all of the partners that I have in the Netherlands and Germany and Indonesia and so on, we look to influence policymakers. So
Mhm.
we make animated videos about cultural aspects of climate adaptation, mostly in the Netherlands, but insofar as the Netherlands is a sort of a signal country because of its precarious below sea level situation, it's relevant for many low-lying countries, regions, cities, etc. So we recognize in ways that I think are really important that climate adaptation is complicated,
Mhm.
um, and to sort of to reduce and simplify is to falsify the situation, and it doesn't really get you further. But it's important to call attention. It's important to tell the story about the complexity in a way that is clear and that gets you
Mhm.
further along, um, and that helps sway policymakers as well as the public, as well as folks operating in the sector, the climate sector, the climate adaptation sector, the water sector, et cetera, so that they get a better understanding of what they're doing. It might be a sort of meta understanding that gives them some perspective and helps them realize, oh, actually, what we're doing right now is a form of maladaptation. It might seem to make sense in the moment, but in a bigger picture, it doesn't make sense, and
Mhm.
therefore we need to reassess, et cetera. So, anyway, I think there are cultural reasons why things aren't, let's say, moving as fast as they should. There are cultural reasons um, why people prefer one kind of solution over another. And it might be the case that the solution they prefer is the one that just is convenient, easy, the way we always did things, etc. And that needs to be called into question. And animated video and other sort of cultural modes um, are really effective ways when targeted of bringing about change in the minds of policymakers
Mhm.
or of others who are involved, and that's what we aim for.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. And you also mentioned about your work in Indonesia, the Netherlands, and Germany in the United States, and you have done a lot of work in these countries and others too. I also personally come from Armenia, which is I think the problem of climate change is perceived very very differently than here in the United States, and I think it is also a great aspect of the culture and how the society perceives the problem. Um, I would say, and so how do you think? What does the cross-cultural perspectives look like uh, with your experience that you have done in these different countries? And I mean, for example, in Armenia, there are more urgent questions that need to be solved, and in many other countries too, especially in the third world countries.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you think the society, the culture should aim this issue, considering that it is not, it is urgent, but it may not be as urgent as
Mm-hmm.
other issues?
Right. Yeah. It's a really great question, Gevorg, and it requires, let's say, a differentiated and relatively subtle answer.
Yeah.
I'm going to first make a really big division between mitigation and adaptation, right? In the case of countries of the global south, developing countries, countries where the carbon footprint per capita is really small, where historical carbon is practically non-existent,
Mhm.
you know, to sort of impose or require those countries, to put their all into an energy transition to renewables without providing adequate support is ridiculous, right, on the face of it. And that, I think, goes to that question about there are more urgent issues,
Mhm.
right? So that issue is urgent and it's very urgent for them, but the people who need to solve that problem are not the citizens of that vulnerable country, but rather the United States, China, uh,
Mhm.
you know, the European Union, historical emitters and currently large-scale emitters of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So that's the mitigation question. The climate adaptation question, however, that integrates well with the urgencies that are felt in these countries. There are opportunities there as well as challenges and problems that really need to be addressed.
Mhm.
Employment, poverty, health, all of those are very urgent issues, and I think that they integrate relatively seamlessly into concerns about, global warming in the sense of things getting hotter and hotter and hotter, um, land becoming less arable, um, water becoming more scarce, drought as a problem. If it's coastal, sea level rise, increasing tides, tidal intrusion, saltwater intrusion, all of these things affect the day to day of people who, may be on living on just a sustenance wage, and there, I think there are opportunities to intervene that can come from the ground up, can come from the culture itself. Often in these countries, there are forms of traditional ecological knowledge uh, that have been abandoned under the pressure of corporate or sort of industrial
Mhm.
agriculture or other forms of kind of global capitalism, intervening there, and those forms of traditional ecological knowledge often were all about living sustainably with the resources at hand. In the case of low-lying areas, growing with the sea. In other words, actually, rivers and the sea and the sediment that they trade, and the let's say the mangrove forests and other seagrasses and other sorts of things. All of these things, when managed correctly or allowed to do their job, actually result in the increase of land. So land rises, more land grows. The land that we're losing on the Louisiana coast is land that the Mississippi River created over tens of thousands of years. And now, because we've cut off the sediment flow, it's disappearing. And disappearing really, really fast, eroding away at a rate that is just shocking. And that's happening all over the world. And so returning to traditional ecological knowledge in many cases will be very helpful. So that's just one example, but there's so many more. So I think that funding from these nations, which they owe these countries because their relationship to these countries have been extractive and have involved all kinds of forms of injustice, including slavery, for instance, and therefore these countries, wealthy countries, owe them a debt. They owe them a debt, and that debt could best be paid. They owe them reparations. That debt could best be paid in making funding available and collaborating with, in a sort of multilateral, or really a dialogical way and not a monological way, with these populations to adapt to the climate change as it occurs in that country, so that employment increases, resources are secured. The possibility clean water is secured, and so on. So I think that's where there's a real opportunity, and that's where it should be happening.
Awesome, yeah. Great examples. And we have also talked about that it is the most importantly we have to talk to the policymakers, and we have to work with them, let's say. And how would you say the reaction was with working with the policymakers in different countries? I mean, I would say I will try to give an example. Let's say let's give an example, because we have also talked about the fundings from different institutions. Let's talk about, let's say, the United Nations that funds climate activities in different countries. But let's give an example of a country that tries to represent in an institution in different committees, but they are giving a priority to represent it in different committees rather than the climate change. And and because of the countries, like the government's whole priority is in different issues, how would you say the policymakers still react to the urgency of the climate change, and if they try to do some meaningful steps towards it, or they are just trying to do something just for like a check mark or something else? Do they really try to be put a big emphasis on it, or
So I went to my first COP, right? So my first climate summit, which was in Dubai this past December. And I've had interactions with policymakers, both abroad, but also at Perry World House here on the Penn campus. And can't make a blanket statement about policymakers, but by and large, if they are working in the climate space, let's say if they're at the COP, or they've sent representatives to the COP, or if they're, let's say, in Indonesia participating in an initiative that the Dutch government started, and that brings together experts and policy people from the Netherlands, from the United States, from Indonesia, or same program, but then in Bangladesh or in India, etc. By and large, I am going to assume, and I think it's safe to assume,
Mm.
that policymakers get it. You can get into the details about exactly what they get, because there's a tendency, not just among policymakers, but among people in general, to lowball, the impacts of climate change, not to want to acknowledge or recognize, how scary it is, because it's scary.
Yeah,
All right.
indeed.
Now, if these, and it, all of them, doesn't matter, global north, global south, every policymaker recognizes how serious climate change is. And at the same time, they have brakes on what they're willing to do. They'll apply the brakes, and they'll apply the brakes for various reasons. Let's say if they're in a democracy, or let's say a country that holds elections, it's tricky, because there's a trend towards populism, and populists get mileage out of denying climate change,
Yeah.
and saying it's not there, it's ridiculous to be spending this kind of money, we could use this money elsewhere, or and it would be of more immediate benefit, etc. And there are many voters who are willing to listen to this. So that means that the policymaker who is operating in a country where elections are held needs to be, I don't know, strategic about
Yeah.
what they do and what they say, what they can do, what they can't do, etc. And we could look at our country as an example. I'm going to say, I said our country, but what do I know? I mean, we could look at the United States as an example. I happen to be an American citizen, so I'll say that. And I think, for instance, that Biden has done a great deal. The Biden government has done an enormous amount of work. Most of it is stealth, so it's happening under the radar, and that's strategic, right? It's strategic because if they trumpeted it, there would probably be a huge backlash, right? So it's risky. So they're working really, really hard behind the scenes. Some of it is upfront, like the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure
Yeah.
legislation, and so on, that they got through. They had to do that. That was important. But I have a feeling they're not touting it as much as you would maybe expect, because if folks really realized how much they were doing, there would probably be a backlash. At the same time, they're approving, new natural gas and oil extraction all over the place, right? And they've made all kinds of compromises with Manchin, with others, in order to do what they needed to do. So that's just an example of how a policymaker can be aware,
Mm.
knows what they need to do, and is working towards it, but at the same time has to apply the brakes,
Yeah.
has to be discreet, can't do, etc. In other instances where maybe elections aren't such a big deal, and I'm not saying this isn't the case in this country either, of course, you have to work with your industry, with your economy,
Yeah.
etc. And there too, it gets tricky. It's like, what are the powers behind the power? And how do you get them on board, etc. So politics is, by its nature, a really, what we say, a dynamic and tricky kind of game,
Yeah.
and I think that's how folks are operating in this space. I think it's really, really important because you can get kind of depressed or discouraged by that situation, but I think that's a relatively realistic description of the situation. It's really important not to lose sight of the fact that in the field of technology, there is such an explosion of research and implementation going on, innovation going on, that it's become a really exciting thing to watch. I mean, I sometimes think of where we are right now as being like in a thriller. Like
Yeah.
we're in the midst of an eco thriller where we know who the bad guys are, the fossil fuel folks and the dark money, et cetera, and all those things that are working against us or working against, what needs to be done, the various transitions that need to be done. And that's really discouraging. But there are so many good guys operating in many different areas. And as is appropriate, I think, for an eco thriller, in the technology sector, there's a kind of like race against time. Just like we were racing, to get a COVID vaccination
Mm.
in the shortest imaginable, amount of time, we are also doing that for, sources of renewable energy, et
Yeah.
cetera, all kinds of other things as well. And at universities like Penn, in the United States, but in universities all over the world, also in China, et cetera, things are moving at such an incredibly fast clip. We have no idea. So while you've got climate change really ratcheting up and going faster and faster, like accelerating sea level rise, ice sheet melt in Antarctica and Greenland, slowing down of the ocean, circulation system, all of these things that you can point to that are accelerating, it's also accelerating on the other side. And that's why it seems like a thriller where you just
Yeah.
don't know, which one's going to cross the finish line first.
Yeah, yeah. It was a great example of how like they intersect, and the great way to also introduce how the policy making process goes under the scenes for the climate change initiatives and everything connected to the climate. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, I think this will also be helpful for the folks that are also interested in the policy making field in the climate change. And yeah, so going back to the culture, uh, you've mentioned about the animation films, animation movies that you make, and you also encourage people to make that. And I also think it has a great impact on people, on how people perceive the climate change, of how urgent it is, of what we need to do. I mean, and this example was seen with other problems in the society that was decided to show through movies, through cultures, through storytelling. Let's say, for example, feminism problems that people try to show through movies or try to make people understand it. So, how would you? But for climate change, as a kid growing up, I wouldn't say I have seen that much of movies with an emphasis on climate change or trying to teach people about this issue. And most of the movies and the animation projects that I came through, it was uh, from the from the students from the universities or people who were trying to make it accessible, but I wouldn't say it was from big productions that are trying to make it available for wider audiences. So how would you say, I mean, the first question will probably be of how do you think, with the experience that you already have, how big is the impact on people of through movies or literature or art? How big is the impact, and do you think the productions involved in this field actually support those initiatives and also understand the urgency and try to give
Mm-hmm.
more funds to that? Or yeah, and what do you think about that?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So you've got Hollywood churning out movies.
Yeah.
Occasionally, there's a movie there that you know addresses ecological issues. Avatar,
Mm. Yeah,
Avatar
yeah.
One, the first one. Um, you know, Slightly problematic movie, especially with regard to, let's say, the representation of indigenous people, but and the sort of this pattern of requiring a white Western, white American hero to solve the problems. But it's a movie that very clearly calls attention to two colliding worlds,
Mm.
extraction
Yeah.
and an indigenous way of living in harmony with the magical forces of nature. And by magical, I don't mean magic. I mean the forces of nature are just incredible. It's just astonishing. All right, so that's pretty clear. And that was seen by very, very, very many people. Did it change many minds? And when you hold that one up against all of the crap that Hollywood produces, which is watched at rates that exceed, let's say the rates of viewership for Avatar, and there's so much more. And all of these, pretend that climate change doesn't exist. It's not even in the background, right? Because that's one question you can ask is there an awareness of climate change in the narratives we tell, even if climate change isn't the focus? And in most of these, they're not, right? It just assumes we're still in the Holocene, nothing is changing, it's all stable, etc. Okay, so there's that. And that may change yet. And if it does, it will probably change because climate change insists on it. I think, for many of the changes that lie ahead in culture and in policy, climate change is going to be the force that pushes that through. Climate change is, in a bizarre way, our ally, because it will be so insistent that you can no longer ignore it, right? Okay. But I look away from that, from let's say the blockbusters and the kind of work that they can do. Maybe they can, but I'm not sure. I look instead at slightly more targeted kinds of things. So in the realm of climate fiction, I think there's a lot of energy, a lot of innovation, a lot of outstanding storytelling going on. And I think it's cutting across genres. And I think it's engaging new readership. So I think that there's more exciting stuff happening there. And you can point to a whole bunch of different examples, but one which I think really had the kind of impact that I think that we aspire to, and that would be like the work of Kim Stanley Robinson recently. So Ministry for the Future, New York 2140, et cetera. These extremely well-researched, very kind of what we say comprehensive understandings and visions of, sort of how various, cultural, economic, political systems operate in relation to nature and the climate. And how, a realistic kind of sense of those, but also through the complexity, the darkness, the countervailing forces, managing to create a credible story of how we go forward that doesn't, wash over the impacts that we will undoubtedly face, but also imagines how a society or how world governments or how banks, how all kinds of players in the field willingly or unwillingly might cooperate. So I think that's incredible, because that Kim Stanley Robinson with that novel really made a splash. I mean, he crossed over. So many people who don't read climate fiction read that novel. Obama thought it was like a picnic for policymakers. He just loved it. It's a climate fiction for wonks. And it was really, really great. And I think you can go down a list of many different climate fiction writers and say, wow, they are helping us to imagine not just how messed up things are going to be, but how it would be possible for human institutions to respond and respond effectively. So I think that that's really important. Can I plug Poltergeist? I mean, we haven't even mentioned it, right? So the animated videos we make feature a little character who looks somewhat like me, whose name is Dr. Poldergeist, with a D, as in the Dutch polders. And with a kind of gentle humor, he criticizes and calls into question the way that Dutch climate adaptation is proceeding and water management is working, and also on the basis of research that is done with climate adaptation experts in the Netherlands. So basically, we're promoting their difficult message, making their difficult message to Dutch policymakers and the public more accessible, and I think also more urgent, more justifiable, more comprehensible, so that these changes can be effected, right? So that's sort of where we're working. I think that
Yeah.
I started with this word, I think, and I come back to it. I think it's really important to target, your audience, not just to sort of throw it out there, but to know what kind of change is it through your cultural intervention that you want to affect.
Awesome. Yeah. That's a great notice about it, and we will also have the names and everything about the animation videos in the introduction too. So feel free to also go and watch them. Awesome. And yeah, I think we are coming to the end, and I was I wanted, if you have some kind of, let's say, call to action or some for the people that are watching, if you would like to make, or some final remarks about what also we people can do in these terms, to also in our individual efforts to uh, help the cause of the climate change, of what we can do to as individuals to make it. Yeah.
Yep.
So
Okay. So you use that word individuals,
yeah.
and I understand totally why that question comes, but you're an individual within an institution
Of
or within
course,
multiple
yes.
institutions. um, Premise one.
Yeah.
Premise two, we need systemic change. An individual changing their behavior isn't going to make the difference. So that's often presented as a sort of either or, and I reject that fundamentally.
Mm,
It's not an either or. You as an individual have leverage. You as a young individual have less leverage than you will have when you're 30, 40, 50. But the amount of leverage that you have when you're 30, 40, 50 depends on how you use the leverage that you have
mm,
now, right? The more you leverage your influence now, the more you will be able to leverage later, right? So you need to start now. In other words, by leverage, I mean take a look around you, see where you have influence. You have influence in your circle of friends, with the institutions you interact with your clubs, your organizations, within your classroom. If you're on let's say your major advisory board, your UAB or whatever that's called, you have some influence there. Um, you have influence, possibly through actions that could involve things like activism, let's say
mm,
demonstrating,
yeah.
camping out, working with fossil free pen. That is a way. It's not the only way. It's a way in order to create leverage. When you do that with some other individuals, you do create leverage. You force an administration eventually to come to terms with you one way or the other. But you can do that in other ways as well. You can work within the institution. You can nudge and push and urge people so that they have to respond to you. As a student, you already have considerable leverage. But if you don't use it, your message doesn't get out. You don't stand out. People don't take notice of you. You don't find who new allies are. It's when you make use of your leverage that people take notice of you, and then you get more opportunities. So that word leverage matters a lot to me. It's the way that I explain how I, as a professor of 18th century or scholar of 18th century German literature, you know, became one of the people who got Climate Week at Penn off the ground, or
Mm,
who gets invited by the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water to participate in think tanks about how to adapt to a sea level rise in the Netherlands, et cetera. You know, if I hadn't done these things that I did at early stages, like go to Paul Snigovsky and say, I think we need to hijack the 60-second lectures. If I hadn't done that, nothing would have happened, right? So you have
definitely,
to
yeah.
you have to leverage what you've got in order to increase your leverage.
Definitely, yeah. I think it's the right approach to it, and also I think we are now in the century where we can just, even if you want to get involved in the environmental field or do something for the climate change, you can just go to Google, maybe write some organizations I can get involved in, or what I can do, and it will be tons of hundreds of ways of you can get involved, and also so it is definitely the right approach of trying to get together with people, get together with the institutions, and try to do something together. And that's the power of unity we can have in solving these problems. And also just trying to, and I think it doesn't take much to get involved in something also small. It doesn't have, for all of the people, it doesn't have to be uh just, let's say, dedicating our life to solving the climate change issues. It can just be, for example, for the students, just joining a small student club, or joining a small non-profit, or dedicate a couple of hours a week, which can, yeah,
I don't want to diminish this step, though.
yeah,
I mean, I understand small, that might
yeah,
be an
but
encouragement, but I actually want people to be ambitious.
yeah,
Penn students are ambitious.
yes,
And I don't, and so I'm not sure that delivering a message about, oh, it's okay if it's a small step, that's because why would one want to do a small step?
yeah,
And also I think it's really important to realize that small step is important,
of
but the
course,
small step
definitely,
allows larger steps, right?
yes,
So it's on a trajectory.
yes,
I also think that it's really important to realize it doesn't matter what discipline you chose. Climate change is going intersects that
yeah,
discipline,
yeah, yeah,
and ask yourself the question, or ask your professor,
definitely, yeah, and
how does it intersect, and what are you all doing?
and definitely, and today we were also talking about the intersection of culture and climate change, and definitely we can have all the fields kind of can intersect with climate change. So yeah, that's a great remark on that. So we are coming to the end. Thank you so much, Professor Richter, for joining us today, and it was a great conversation, and for all your work that you have done in this field and the work that you are doing right now. It is great, and thank you so much for sharing your experience and sharing your advices with us today. Yeah, thank you so much for this. And yeah,
It's been my pleasure,
of
Gevorg.
course.
I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for giving me the chance.
Thank you so much. And to all our listeners, thank you so much for joining another episode of Talking Environment. And let's continue solving the climate change issues with the efforts that we do together. So, thank you so much. And until next time, take care. Thank you.